Good morning and welcome to day 2 of Varjokirjamessut. Today we're going to have a multilingual discussion, mainly in English, but also a bit perhaps in Swedish. It's still unclear in which forms that will take, but feel free to ask questions in both languages. And yeah, we will stick mainly to English, but keep an open and playful mind to languages. So today we're going to talk about Finlandssvensk antifascism, Politik, debatt och litteratur 1920 till 1950, which is edited by Anders Ahlbäck, Mattias Kaihovirta, and Ylva Perera. And with us here we have Anders Ahlbäck and Ylva Perera. Thank you for coming. It's quite a book of almost 500 pages that has chapters on different writers, poets, about newspapers, workers, politicians, sailors, and even housewives. So it's a wide and broad volume and a very interesting read. When I've told people that I'm going to interview the authors of the book Finlandssvensk antifascism, many people have reacted, Finlandssvensk antifascism, Finnish-Swedish antifascism, that sounds cool, but what is it? So that's my first question to you.
Thank you. Well, the purpose of this book, which is the outcome of a research project which was financed by Svenska litteratursällskapet in Finland, was to investigate whether it can be observed a special motivation or tendency among the Swedish-speaking population of Finland to resist fascism and Nazism in the 1920s, 30s and 40s. And the reason for us asking this question is that, well, fascism is of course a very broad concept. It's not a clearly defined ideology, but what is usually a part of fascist movements are a will to unify and to be against all sorts of minorities. So then naturally we thought that it would be interesting to see if the Swedish-speaking minority in Finland at this time felt a motivation to resist fascism due to this minority status. So what we are doing in this book is not saying that all Swedish-speaking Finns were anti-fascists, because sadly we have a lot of proof of that not being the case. But we are interested in bringing to light those actors who did resist or oppose fascism and see if they have any common motivators, because as you say in this book we look at very different segments of the population. It's like it varies from left to right, and it's different classes, different genders, different walks of life that are represented, but we wanted to see if we can find a common denominator here. Would you agree with this answer?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And if we already at the outset here would try to summarize the outcome, we might say that no, there was not such a thing as a Finland-Swedish anti-fascism, just in the same way as there was no European anti-fascism as somehow one coherent movement. Just as fascism was very heterogeneous, of course, also in Europe, in Finland, and within this minority, as Ylva already said, different groups and different individuals resisted fascism for rather different reasons. In the left, and the anti-fascism of the left is of course the most well known, and this term is even usually associated with the workers' movement and with the left. There they opposed fascism mainly because they saw it as a threat against the working class. With good reason, because fascism, of course, it was one thing it had on its program everywhere in Europe was that it was anti-communist, anti-socialist. But then again, in the political middle, the liberals and even the right, the conservatives, there were mainly other reasons. I mean, they didn't care. They even sympathized with this anti-communism. But they again, some of them resisted fascism because some of them saw it as a threat against the Swedish language in Finland, against minority rights. And more broadly, also many people in the political middle and the left, they were very troubled by by the lawlessness and the political violence and the kind of the methods that the fascists used. And they thought that especially, a society which is not ruled by law is not a good place for minorities, because the law is always the best best protection for minorities. So you had a range of different groups and different opinions, and they did not really come together, because the time we are looking at, Finland in the 1920s and 1930s, was, of course, it was a very divided society after the Finnish Civil War, and the left and the right had it was a very big gap, to come together and cooperate.
So that makes a lot of sense. There's no Finnish-Swedish anti-fascism, but there's a lot of examples of some forms in the book. Do you want to tell a little bit about yourselves and how you ended up writing this book?
Yeah, thank you. So I should also say that I am a scholar of comparative literature, and in this project is a collaboration between scholars of literature and historians. And so for me, why I became involved in this project, well, because there was a need for a PhD student to carry out an investigation, a research about anti-fascism in Finland-Swedish literature, which happened to be an area that I was very, very interested in. So I was very lucky to get this opportunity. And then I started looking at what kinds of authors could be relevant to look at, because we have some authors that are quite known for their anti-fascism at this point. For example, Elmer Diktonius, who was a socialist poet who was very active also in the international anti-fascist movement. Or we could have a even more communist writer as Allan Wallenius, or we have the more bourgeoisie writers or liberal writers as, for example, Hans Ruin or Arvid Mörne, who would place himself somewhere in between. But I found a writer who is called Mirjam Tuominen, who is not very well researched. There's not much research written about her, even though she was a very acclaimed writer when she made her debut in the 1938, and also during the 1940s she received good critique of her work. And she is a writer who I became very interested in because she's not an activist per se. She was really outspoken in her values, and she was really early to call out the Nazi tendencies that also was very prominent in Finland, also within the Swedish-speaking minority at this point, and critical of Finland's collaboration with Nazi Germany in the Second World War and so forth. But she doesn't write. How should I say? It's not like propaganda or activist poetry or prose. It's very what I find. And I'm not saying that would be anything wrong with that, but as a literary scholar, it's really interesting to look at her work because it is. She writes short stories and essays, and it's not so much about conveying a particular set of arguments or a political stance, but she is more trying to investigate in her fiction writing how fascism works, what fascism is, and how it affects each and every one of us, also on like an interpersonal level. And this is something I, as a literary scholar, but I also have a background in philosophy, found very interesting, and that I wanted to look further into. And I'm also a journalist. I work at Hufvudstadsbladet as a literary editor. So I have time off and I've been doing this research, but naturally my interest in this field is also very combined with being a part of the offentlighet, public sphere, public discussion, I find it's like disturbingly easy to draw parallels between these research and what we see today, and this has also been very fascinating and fascinating in a scary sense to me.
Yeah. I came to this project. I was kind of invited by some of the other scholars, some younger researchers who participate in the book at the who were working at the history department at Ahlbäck Ylva University, they had been working on almost global networks of anti-fascists, and those were kind of the real kind of communist anti-fascist networks with connections to Moscow and so on in the early 1930s, and they then come up with the idea to kind of bring this topic home and look at, well, if that was what was going on in Berlin and London and Moscow, then what about little Finland and the Swedish speaking minority. Myself, I had worked on this period, but I'm actually an expert on the history of masculinities, so I had been working on political masculinities, especially in the Finnish military and conscription and so on. But I thought immediately that fascism is well known for its almost caricature kind of ultra masculinity. The fascists were very, very keen on muscular male bodies and women as housewives and mothers, and this kind of ultra conservative gender order. So I thought it would be interesting to look at did the anti-fascists somehow pick this up? Did they criticize this and so on? And so I did a study on some liberal intellectuals who they didn't so much perhaps pick up the explicit gender ideology of fascism, but they did use this kind of very gendered language where they kind of try to argue that these fascists, they are no real men because they want to submit to the dictator's will. They want to kind of run with the masses. They don't have any independent will or intellect. They don't have a moral backbone, so they are so emotional. They let their emotions carry them away, and they are almost hysterical. So they kind of, in a way, feminized or demasculinized the fascists in their attempt to kind of resist fascism, which of course can be perhaps was not the most sympathetic way of resisting fascism from today's point of view, but it is very interesting to see what kind of imaginary and notions they draw on when they try to explain to their readers why fascism is not a good thing.
Yeah, that was something that surprised me a lot when reading your chapter, the finding in a way misogynist arguments and accusing the fascists of similar thing that women often are accused of. I did not see that coming.
No, and you can sadly find racist arguments as well, like people who are criticizing Nazi Germany or Italy for being African or something like this. So it's nothing at all barbaric, like using a very colonial and imperialist rhetoric. So this has also been, to me at least, a very important part of this research to see how entangled all sorts of power dynamics are in this political projects that we explore in this book.
Yeah, it's perhaps important to point out that these anti-fascists, they were absolutely no saints, but they were, of course, they were products of their time, thinking about humanity in terms of, more and less civilized peoples. For example, everybody did that. It would kind of be you cannot expect these people to kind of be completely on the outside of that. And also, from today's point of view, these leftist groups who resisted fascism very much, today you can see that they, in their turn, supported rather totalitarian communist regimes and so on. So it's it's not black and white at all.
No, and I must say that coming from an activist background myself, I find it very enlightening to get a more, how should I say, it also increases your understanding for how political work is and can be done, because it is this set of entangled dynamics at play where people who choose to resist fascism can have very different motivators, and sometimes unholy alliances are formed between groups that really don't have much in common, and sometimes it can lead to something productive, like actually resistance being made, and sometimes the fact that you are approaching this from very different perspectives might lead to, well, you taking out each other instead or things like that. So, but I must say it's been a very eye-opening experience to look into these actors that we are exploring in this book.
Staying still a bit on the question of masculinity. So if I read you correctly, then one of the reasons why there wasn't maybe a wider Finnish-Swedish anti-fascist expression was the fear of communism, and then more liberal bourgeois journal, like press writings, etc., were afraid of that and kind of flirting with fascism. But I wonder then about today, because that would maybe not be the excuse today. And so why is it that today there isn't a wider anti-fascist support? And do you think kind of this has something to do with the role of masculinity, or in a way the how we see mansrollen today?
The male role. That's a very interesting question. I think it's so much more, as a historian, it's so much more difficult to see kind of clearly in your own time because everything is going on. It's always easier in hindsight because we have the outcome. That's also one thing that was interesting, as an experience doing research in the 1920s and 1930s, trying always to remember that they did not know what was going to happen. I mean, we see all this through the lens of the ultimate disaster of the Second World War and the Holocaust and so on. But of course, nobody knew that was going to happen. And in the same way, today, perhaps we don't know yet quite where this is going. In terms of masculinity, of course, well, that's a huge discussion. It's perhaps not quite as clear cut. If you look at Mussolini and if you look at Hitler, from today's viewpoint, they are almost ridiculously clear cut. They are dressing up in military uniforms. Neither had any military career to talk about, but they very much liked to perform as these kind of military men, and they had these huge military parades, and it was a very clear cut. There were no women anywhere in the political leadership of Nazism or fascism. Today, in these movement, right-wing ultranationalist movements which have, let's say, fascist tendencies, it's more complicated. I mean, there is a lot of talk about kind of, rather conservative gender roles, but then on the other hand, they have several very prominent female leaders. In Germany, in France, the leaders of the Alternative für Deutschland, the leader of the Rassemblement National in France, they are both women. And that kind of blurs the image a lot. So I don't know. It's difficult to say. Of course, you can find, especially within kind of the fringe groups, like the real neo-Nazi groups, there you can find this kind of ultra-masculinist performances. But I don't think those perhaps are the biggest problems. The biggest problems are these really big movements with 25-30% of the popular vote who are, I wouldn't say they are fascist, but they are kind of, they have kind of forgotten the lesson. They are not careful anymore. For many decades after the Second World War, politics in Europe was very careful of not going down the same road, never again. And these movements seem to have kind of, they don't care anymore about that lesson. So they go down some very dangerous routes in terms of limiting press freedom, in terms of questioning the independence of the judiciary, of the courts,
yeah.
courts of law, in terms of intimidating political opponents with even violent means, and that's all kind of familiar stuff from the fascist playbook.
But you wouldn't call it fascist.
I don't. That's a big discussion. You could do it, but there is no clear-cut definition of fascism, and the question is, whether can we move forward today? I mean, like 15 years ago, when these movements had perhaps 2 or 5%, then that discussion maybe could have been fruitful. But in a situation where 30% of the population is voting for these, I don't think fascism is really mainly. Very few movements have ever called themselves fascist. It's usually always been kind of a label you put on your opponent in order to say, you're bad, you're an idiot. And whatever we think today, I think it's not a productive way of finding a dialogue and getting out of this situation to put that label on such a big portion of the population. Maybe the historians in 100 years can be able to do it, but today I think it's.
But I think it depends on.
Maybe you disagree.
I think it depends on what you want to achieve in certain contexts. I mean, it's like the important thing to remember is that like we're not done after we've decided something is fascist, and then we know that, and then what next? I mean, the point. But I do think, because I can see also that trying to police people from using the word fascist or the term fascist is also an effective way sometimes to normalize or neutralize what is happening, and not recognizing the fascist tendencies or the really clear links to how fascism operates that are in play in a much wider sense than also within just these movements. I'm thinking spontaneously about how we are also here in Scandinavia and Finland and Sweden very prone to let let's see if I find the vocabulary for this in English, but like
You can say in Swedish.
Yeah, okej. När jag tänker på hur vi ger upp vår personliga integritet, hur vi släpper in mera övervakning i samhället, like for example when we have this fear, the politicians are talking about gang violence or I don't know, these kind of things, then the solution is that okay, we should be able to police people more, we should be able to read people's personal conversations, blah, 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 and this is all not done in the name of safety. And I would say this securitization is very much, it's not like that it's always equal to fascism, but it is a fascist strategy to invadera or like to I'm trying to invade the personal integrity and personal space. So I mean, I think it's sometimes quite fruitful to actually name this a fascist tendency, to make it clear that this is dangerous. It's not just something that is a neutral political tool, which is usually presented as. So for that reason, I see it as a quite important tool to use to actually use this term, but it of course needs to be carefully thought, like what do you want to achieve at a certain point when you are using it. I would say, because what I feel is very clear is that fascism is almost always a response to threat, to a chaos. I mean, back in this time, as we say, communism was the thing that was used as the reason for like buying into fascism. Like communism is so scary that we like anything else is better, so let's try this fascism instead. And nowadays, I mean, if you see, it's usually like all these authoritarian leaders that when they gain popularity, or the totalitarian movements, it's usually because they say stuff like, oh, immigration creates chaos, or like we have like the economy is not like it's uncontrollable, so now we need to have like stronger control. And so that fascism is usually, I would say, a response to a lack of control or some imagined threat. And that can look quite different in different times, like what the threat is different, but the response is quite similar.
Yeah. And I mean, there is a perception of threat, but then what these fascist politicians do, of course, is that they blow it up. A good example is Finland in 1930, where we had this Lapua movement, which was, perhaps the closest we got to I don't know if a fascist. Well, we got pretty close to a fascist takeover. You know, there was they attempted a coup and so on, and there was legislation against the communists and so on. But this Lapua movement, they kind of whipped up this almost hysterical mood of, you know, an imminent communist threat. And it is true there were some communist activities, but it wasn't a huge thing, and the authorities had absolutely no problem keeping it in check. But that's what populist demagogics do. It's the same thing with immigration, for example. Obviously, there are lots of problems surrounding immigration and integration and so on. But what these populist movements do, they kind of whip it up into some kind of existential threat, or the globalization of the economy and so on. Obviously, there are problems, there are threat perceptions, but they, you know, they whip it up in order to construct this kind of construct a logic of, you know, that we are now allowed to take extraordinary means. We can push aside, you know, legislation and protocol, and we can
Human rights.
even retort to violence, and everything is kind of. I mean, just look at how these immigration authorities in the U.S. the methods they are using. They are using violence. And of course, it's based on this narrative of somehow this immigration being a somehow huge threat to the U.S., which is of course ridiculous.
Making a hopefully functioning bridge between a lot of people voting for fascist tendencies and what Ylva is writing about Mirja Tuominen, and also using a little bit of Deleuze and Guattari and their concept of microfascism, and in a way the fascist potential in all of us. Do you want to tell a little bit about more about that?
Please. Thank you. So I have my chapter in this book is about Mirjam Tuominen's anti-fascist poetics. So I'm trying to see, and I should also mention that I have a chapter in this book, but I also wrote a PhD dissertation that I defended 3 weeks ago. So then I have a broader range of things that I can look at in Mirjam Tuominen. But one thing that I look at in this particular volume is how her idea of writing or art more broadly can be perceived as an anti-fascist practice. And there I find out that in her view, the role of the anti-fascist writer should be to look clear-sighted both at what is going on in the surroundings and what is going on within oneself. So she was, after the Holocaust was made evident for everyone, in Finland there was this, now we're talking about 1946-47, the sales of romantic escapist literature has never been higher in Finland Swedish literature, because everybody just wanted to read about romantic adventures and not thinking about what had happened and what our role in it had been. And Mirjam Tuominen's response to this was to write a book called Bitter Brew, Karvas juoma in Finnish, Besk brygd på svenska, where she writes quite clearly that you, reader, are responsible for what has happened. You are as responsible as we all are, and we cannot we cannot allow ourselves not to deal with this. And a way of dealing with this is to write as she does, in a way where you are not closing your eyes to the fascist tendencies that are prominent also in small, private, intimate relations. She writes a lot about relationships between parents and children, between lovers, between families, between humans and animals. She's a very early on makes the connection between how people treat animals, the structured, systematic, industrialized killing of animals, and how the Nazis treated people in the Jews and other people in the concentration camps. And what she sort of does is showing how the dangers of fascism lies in allowing yourself to submit, to a system where you stop taking individual personal responsibility. You just do what you are like, what everybody seems to be thinking that is okay to do, basically. And using Deleuze and Guattari's concept of microfascism, to me, was a fruitful way to show how, like, because they differ between, or make the distinction between macrofascism, which is like the institutionalized fascism, how it works like on a political level, and then microfascism is how it works on a more interpersonal. I know now I'm butchering Deleuze and Guattari and simplifying it way too much, but I'm not gonna try to have an elaborate explanation in English in this early in the morning. But anyway, so the important thing is that she shows how it's not like this political institutionalized movements work independently on how we treat each other in the private sphere, and also how we sort of aspire, how we relate to the power dynamics between us and within ourselves. Like everybody has a fascist drive, in a way, one could say, in her understanding. And writing and fiction and art comes into the picture because art is a way where you can like observe these fascist tendencies clearly without like excusing them and without saying we can overcome them ever, like totally, because that's a very important thing within her view of anti-fascism. It's not like a stance you can just take and then you're done. It's not a like a position that you can never be confident in just having, like, okay, I am anti-fascist and that means I am on the right side or anything. But it is it needs to be like, because you can always, there's always the danger that what you do will be benefiting the fascist regime or the fascist structures, even though that might not be your intention. So what she is advocating instead is like this constant practice of also practicing anti-fascism, like as an inner practice, an outer practice and an inner practice. And writing is a way to both do this and also to convey this to others. Yeah, that's what I've been trying to show in my chapter in this book.
Thank you.
And one of these copies circulate around the room if you want to have a look.
And when reading about that, I immediately started thinking, so microfascism, what would then be micro-anti-fascism?
Yeah, well, I would say that would be this sort of a constant practice of like never being like, I'm not saying you should be like so constantly stressed or worried, because anti-fascism, micro-anti-fascism is also a lot in Miriam Tominen's writing about joy and about like finding ways to be in community that are not fascist, that are not, tainted by the will to just submit to the how should I say, community in a bad sense, but instead of finding ways to relate to others that are not celebrating strength or power or violence, but instead celebrating vulnerability, or like celebrating the fact that, how should I say, weakness or other types of things that fascist regimes usually want to eliminate. So I would say that's one way of thinking like micro anti-fascism.
Sounds like something we could all do, growing that micro anti-fascist in us. Returning a bit to the question of language. If I understood correctly, language before the 20s wasn't a big unifying question among Finnish Swedes. That instead the community was somehow formed more around class, around if you live in the city or in the countryside, maybe professions, work, there's the part about sailors. And then as part of, then it became a thing, the language question, språkfrågan, both as a project to unify the Finnish-Swedish people, but also as something that fascists want to get rid of. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, that's kind of a very important starting point in this book that, the Finland Swedes, we are in a sense an invention of nationalism. There's, for hundreds and hundreds of years, there's been people in Finland speaking Swedish, but those people have not formed a group. I mean, still today they don't. I mean, there's been fishermen and peasants along the coasts who have been completely ordinary people. Then there have been these people who the Finnish nationalists often associate with Swedishness in Finland. So there were the big estate owners and the industrialists, and there were the educated classes, and especially in the cities and so on. But you have lots of different social groups, and up until 1900, these groups had very little to do with each other. I mean, a big estate owner here in southern Finland would feel no kind of commonality with some kind of poor peasant up on the west coast just because they both happen to speak Swedish. But then, of course, the nationalism comes around, both in the Finnish-speaking population and in the Swedish-speaking population. And the message of nationalism, of course, is that language is the most important thing in life. It defines us, it defines who you are, and your identity, and your culture, and your heritage, and whatnot. But of course, in the Finland-Swedish case, just like on the Finnish-speaking side, this nationalism was always more kind of a rightist project in political terms. The left, the workers' movement, they always thought that, well, language, that's kind of a third-class question. The big questions are the questions of ownership, of income equality, of class struggle. So the left was always like, we don't we're not going to kind of prioritize language, which was both good and bad, so to say, for the forming minority of Finland Swedes. That meant that the Swedish-speaking politicians, they could often cooperate with the Finnish-speaking working class movement, because the working class movement, they didn't care about language, they just wanted reforms for the workers. But then again, it meant that the Swedish-speaking workers, they were not so keen on collaborating with the bourgeoisie on the Swedish side. The Swedish language, what was then Svenska Folkpartiet, Ruotsalainen kansanpuolue, the kind of the bourgeois wing of the Swedish language group, they very much thought that now, fascism is threatening the Swedish language. We need to come together, protecting our language rights and so on. And the representatives of the working class movement, they were like, they were also concerned about, Swedish was important for them too, because it was their language and so on, but not to the degree that they would have cooperated with those capitalists. We must remember that the Civil War was only 10 years ago. In that, if we're talking about 1930, it was only 10, and that was an extremely traumatic experience to both sides, and horrible things were made on both sides. If we think today, back at 12 years, where would I get this? Like 2013, imagine that thousands of people would have been killed and outrageous atrocities committed. It's a small wonder that the society kind of stuck together at all, and it's not very surprising that socialists were not very keen on cooperating with capitalists. So the language question is kind of hovering there all the time. Lots of people who are resisting fascism in Swedish, they do refer to it, but it never becomes this kind of, that, okay, now let's forget all our differences and just let's join together in defending Swedishness against fascism. It never came to that point.
No, but it is interesting to see. We have a chapter here about Svenska Folkpartiet, written by Kasper Braskén, because that I feel is a chapter that's highly interesting from today's perspective, when we have Svenska Folkpartiet sitting in the same government as Sannfinländarna and the True Finns, because in this point where Kasper is writing about, Svenska Folkpartiet was trying to decide how they would relate to the Lapua movement. So because there was a quite big number of Swedish speakers who were active in the Lapua movement, and then so many active in the party thought that okay, we should also support this Lapua movement because they're anti-communists, and yay. But then Kaspar is writing about this Ernst von Born, who was a prominent leader within the Swedish People's Party, and he was also very outspoken against the Lapua movement on the grounds of language, saying that okay, so if Lapua movement now they want to take away the judicial rights from the communists, but that they won't stop there. The next day will come for us. Next day will come for the Swedish speakers, and with this as a motivation, he like managed to turn the party against the Lapua movement.
He's kind of a fun figure because it's not your typical anti-fascist. He was a nobleman. He was the owner of one of the biggest estates in Finland. He was like a very conservative figure, but he was one of the most important people to stand up and say that this is not okay. You cannot accept this unlawfulness, this violence, even for the purpose of resisting communists. We must abide to law. We must abide to peaceful means. We must have a democratic process. So he's kind of a unlikely hero in the anti-fascist struggle.
How about some reactions on the book?
Yeah, well, one thing that is fascinating is that we have gotten a lot of invitations to speak about this in academic circles and in media, which is really nice, and also in a few like more leftist circles. But what has surprised me a little bit is that we no interest from like any more right liberal political sides. I thought that this would be a great opportunity for Svenska Folkpartiet to brand themselves now when they are collaborating with semi-fascists to like show that we can be part of this, but they have for some reason not chosen to take this opportunity. But I would say that we have gotten a lot of interest, or more, not, but I mean more than maybe you usually get. This is after all like an academic book, like thick chapters with lots of footnotes, not the most like how should I say page-turning reads. Maybe no, but why am I saying this? It's a great read. You should all read it.
It's a great read.
It's very very.
But it's also good scholarship.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. And so of course we have noticed that the fact that anti-fascism has become a more relevant or like acute theme today because of the rise of the right-wing and fascist movements, that has been clear in how much attention this book has received. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also, surface matters. I think, the title of the book, anti-fascism, this term, but also the cover, I think, was a good selection by the it was the publisher's graphics designer who wanted to have this. I don't know if you can see it from there, but it's a drawing made by a Finland-Swedish socialist, Erik Fogelberg, who was a socialist, who was a pacifist. He was a part of this idealist movement on the west coast called the Munsala socialism, and he drew these wonderful anti-fascist posters, and this image here, there is a character very much, it's evidently Mussolini, and he's coming walking, and there are like flames in the background, and he's walking on a road paved with skulls. So it's a very powerful image of how like the fascism will lead to mass death and war and violence and so on. And I think the kind of the cover of this book has perhaps earned a bit extra interest than it would have otherwise.
Maybe another like natural choice if we wanted to like bring forth some Finland-Swedish anti-fascist artists would of course have been Tove Jansson, who made these very well-known anti-Hitler Garm caricatures also during this time, but as we know, you don't use Tove Jansson for free, so that could not be the case for this book. But I also want to add that now we have the physical copies here, and those can be bought by SLS, but it's also open access, so you can download this from SLS website as a PDF or as an e-book, so it's accessible also without buying it.
There was one interesting reaction in Ny Tid, which is this Finland-Swedish leftist political and cultural magazine, and they had a review, and their reviewer said what we kind of expected someone to say, because he was kind of a little bit annoyed of how we use anti-fascism, because there is kind of a tradition that anti-fascism has been associated with leftist movement, and we have kind of, or we join a kind of international academic trend where we kind of broaden this term, and we use it as a designation for any form of resistance to fascism from the left to the right. So I mean, for example, Ernst von Born, this noble estate owner and bourgeois party leader, we brand him an anti-fascist, and some people kind of get a pee up their nose from this. People are not kind of used to this way of using the terminology, and it can be discussed, but we argue in this book that it makes sense because it makes visible the whole spectre of resistance to fascism, and how many different actors and many different forms of resistance there were, and also how difficult it was for these different actors to cooperate, how they did not really come together. And that's kind of the point of using the same concept for all these very, very different forms.
Yeah, and if we don't consider anti-fascist as an identity that you can have, like a pure identity, that would mean that you are somehow correct in everything that you do, because as we say, these people are highly problematic in many ways, most of them, but it's still like using anti-fascism as a lens maybe to look at them. You see things, and you see connections between actors that haven't been visible before, and it opens up or deepens the understanding of how political resistance can work.
Let's also open up this conversation and see if there's some questions from the audience. I think this discussion about how widely the term can be used is something I would love to have with you for another hour, but unfortunately we don't have that time. But I can say that in a way, like reading about your own history and how people have acted against fascism, there at least I see it as it creates more spelrum. You have more
space
room for acting. But also seeing like, okay, so there was these people did these things, and why can't we do them today? But yes, any questions? Yes?
Yeah, thank you for your work. It was really nice to hear. I have a question about the micro-fascism. What are the tendencies? What are exactly like? What does it mean?
Yeah.
So wait, quickly. The question repeated for the stream. The question was about microfascism and what are the tendencies in people exactly, or more specifically.
Thank you for that. There are many, but I would, if I'm trying to summarize, I would say it is the tendency to, the point is to say that fascism is not only something that is forced upon us from the outside, like something that we just submit to. It's also something that we desire in a way. That's things that are also attractive to people. For example, being a part of a group, which is a natural thing to want to be. But in that desire to become a part of a group is also inherent, like a danger of just homogenizing, of like not questioning problematic tendencies in that group, of ceasing to think for yourself. So I would say that is maybe the core thing that I see as working with them when we're talking about microfascism, like being observant to how also drives that are positive in many ways also have this dangerous like backside to them, and that they can't be separated from each other. So yeah, that would maybe be how I would answer that question. And there could be many more answers as well.
I could ask if, because you've mentioned a couple characters from the book, if there are like any others who make interesting figures that you want to share.
So the question is if there's some other interesting characters and figures in the book that you would like to share about.
No, many, but what popped up in my mind first is our colleague Matias Kaihovirta, who's also an editor of this book, a historian. He has written about how women within the Finland-Swedish workers' movement, how they mobilized against fascism, which they did. They were really active in the movement, but none of them were allowed to have like a, political role, in the sense that they were not the leaders of the party, and they were not like elected anywhere, most of them at least, but they instead found their way to be politically active, among other things, in how they put up revyer, theater shows, where they made like the mockery of fascists and like very like critical work. So, and that was a way for them to take a space that weren't considered political or important, so that's why they could, as women, take it. But it had a huge impact because these shows were really, really popular and people were coming from near and far to see them. So yeah, that's something I want to...
Particularly two women there, Gudrun Mörne and Anna Wik, and if they would have lived today, they would probably, have become party leaders. But back in those days, even in the workers' movement, the bosses were all men, and it was not thinkable for a woman to take that space. There's also a range of, well, not so many, but a few journalists. There's this guy called Max Hahnemann, who was the editor-in-chief of Svenska Pressen, which was this kind of liberal newspaper. Hufvudstadsbladet was rather conservative and a little bit kind of, running along with the fascist tendencies, and Amos Andersson, who was the owner of both newspapers, he actually sacked this Max Hahnemann because he was too outspoken against the Lapua movement. So
he saw it as an economic threat. He wasn't like Amos Andersson wasn't maybe a convinced fascist, but he was a businessman who did not see it as, he thought it was better to like not be too critical of the Lapua movement.
And then there's a couple of other authors. There's Hagar Olsson, a playwright,
playwright and critic, who is fascinating in we have a chapter on her that I highly recommend, because she also, Judith Moira Bongart has written that she shows how Hagar Olsson's feminism and pacifism was tied to her anti-fascism, and also how her she draws connections between like new materialist feminism and Rosi Braidotti, and so that if you are nerd into theory, that's a very interesting chapter, I would say, that shows connections.
Thank you. Do we have a last question? If not, is there something you would like to still say before we close?
Tack så jättemycket för att vi fick komma hit och prata. Lovely to be here, and please familiarize yourself with the book if you're interested.
Thank you for listening. If anybody would like a paper copy, we have 2 to sell, but as we said, it's also available open access. If you just Google for Finlandssvensk antifascism, you will find it on the publisher's webpage, and you can read it online or download the whole PDF.
Thank you, Anders and Ylva.
Tack.